Hello, my name is Sandy Adamitis, the social media director for the Page International Screenwriting Awards, and your host for the Writers Hangout, a podcast that celebrates the many stages of writing, from inspiration to the first draft, revising, getting a project made, and everything in between. We'll talk to the best and the brightest in the entertainment industry and create a space where you can hang out, learn from the pros, and have fun. Hey writers, it's Sandy. We're going to hit pause on interviewing the Page Award-winning screenwriter series to bring you the latest we have on the Thelma Todd murder mystery we talked about last December. If you haven't listened to the two-part episode, I highly recommend you go back right now and listen. The episodes aired December 4th and 11th of 2022. Of all the screenwriting crime stories we have talked about on the Writers Hangout, the Thelma Todd story is the one people comment about the most. So we put together a panel including a forensic death investigator, a true crime fanatic, and co-host Terry Sampson to discuss the case and give our opinions on what we think happened. The cliff notes for those of you who did listen to the two-part episode, and I'm telling you, go back and listen if you haven't, because you're going to be confused. Thelma Todd was an actress with sharp comedic timing who found success in Hollywood's golden age. She starred in movies with the Marx Brothers, Laurel and Hardy, and Zazu Pitts. At 29, Thelma died under suspicious circumstances. On Saturday, December 15th, 1935, Thelma spent the day Christmas shopping with her mom and attended a dinner thrown by the Lupinos and their actress daughter, Ida Lupino, at the Trocadero, a world-famous restaurant on Sunset Boulevard. Thelma was the guest of honor, and she ran into her ex-husband, Pat DiCicco, and they had words. In the early morning hours, Thelma's driver dropped her off in front of her sidewalk cafe on the PCH, where she lived in an ocean view apartment. Thelma was found dead in her car on Monday, December 17th. According to the Los Angeles coroner, it was death by carbon monoxide poisoning. But rumors have always circulated that Thelma was murdered. The suspects include her live-in boyfriend, screenwriter, director, and businessman Roland West, and ex-husband Pat DiCicco, and even New York mobster Lucky Luciano. Let's get into it. Hey, writers. She's a friend of the podcast, JudyTrueCrime.
I would just like to say thank you very much for inviting me. This is going to be fun.
Great. And my cousin, and someone I'm very proud of, Kyle Finney. And Kyle, we got to see each other over summer. We live in different places. You married my cousin Karen, who happens to be possibly one of the funniest people in the world. So she is difficult to keep up with. She's so fast. But we got to see each other over the summer, and I had no idea what you did for a living. Can you give us your title?
Sure. So I'm a forensic death investigator. I live in Fort Worth, Texas, so I work for our Tarrant County. We're in Fort Worth is the county seat, but Tarrant County is the medical examiner. We cover population about 2 million people, about 1,000 square miles. So I do field investigations. So anytime there's a suspicious death of unnatural means, I go out to the scene and conduct a separate but parallel investigation, generally with the police departments. And I report back for the medical examiners who do the autopsies.
While we were at a picnic table with your children, how fast did I ask you to be on the podcast after I found out what you did?
I think we were a couple minutes in.
Exactly. And Judy, when I told you what Kyle did for a living, how excited did you?
I said, oh my God, I should have him on speed dial.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, last but not least, we have the best co-host in the world, my friend, Terry Sampson.
Yay. Great to be here, and I have no professional standing in any of these conversations, just to tell everybody up front.
But you loved the Thelma Todd story.
I love the Thelma Todd story.
Mhm.
Let's go.
Now we're recording this on Valentine's Day. And what were you saying, Kyle, about Valentine's Day? That what we were going to...
So nothing better for Valentine's Day than to discuss some suspicious deaths of Hollywood starlets from 87 years ago.
Agreed.
Kyle, you have the floor. I know you have a couple of theories. Do you think this case was handled properly?
No. Now, I was not familiar with this case when you first sent it to me. So when I began to do research, I mean, within 2 or 3 minutes, I remember saying to myself, oh boy, this one's a rabbit hole.
Mm.
It slightly stands out in other ways because it seems like the more I dug into it, the more confusing it got. And that was for several different reasons, which we can cover. But there were a lot of angles of it that certainly could have been handled better, more professionally. But again, we're looking at that through the lens of 2023. So what I did was I tried to set ourselves back in a historical context to kind of separate what was maybe truly inappropriate for that time versus what did they really have for knowledge and scientific understanding as well. So I think in certain ways, a lot of the stuff has to get a pass just because it was 87 years ago.
What type of things? DNA? You couldn't do DNA tracing?
Certainly DNA. The big thing that stands out to me in this case where we have a lot of the theories that kind of run the gamut from accident to suicide to murder. And then as you go down the murder angle, it's, there's a list of suspects that is, I mean, it literally reads like a Hollywood script.
Exactly. Judy and Terry, tell us who you think it is. Judy, ladies first.
I think that it's the partner, West.
Roland West.
Roland West. Yes. Somewhere it was said that she was supposed to have a 1:55 a.m. appointment with someone. I was like, well, that's an odd time. But then later it came out that her business partner was very controlling and kind of abusive. And so he had, for some reason, said she better be back by 2. So I could see saying, I got to be back by 1:55 to not get in trouble. But then she came back very late. Because of a bunch of different things, I also think that phone call to the woman who was having the party on Sunday afternoon, who said Thelma Todd called and said, I'm coming to your party. And then, oh, and by the way, I didn't get to change my clothes from last night. So any of those things about that I died Sunday morning are wrong because, that I was in those clothes.
Right.
It kind of sounded like when you're watching one of those shows and a guy calls 911 to say he found his wife dead in the bathtub, but takes the whole 911 call to establish his alibi in detail.
Terry, do you have a...
Yes, without a grassy knoll being involved,
yeah,
I am going to go with Judy.
Judy.
I'm all in. She's right.
Okay. I got to tell you, I'm with Judy too. Kyle, take it.
Yeah,
it's yours.
I don't... If I'm trying to convince you that it is a murder and there's who the suspect is, I would also go with West.
Okay.
However, I kind of want to take a different angle in that I'm not convinced that it is a murder. So I have a couple of angles. And I'm not saying that it's not. I'm saying we're probably going to come up a little bit short on information. So a couple of problems I ran into initially. It was extremely difficult to separate fact from fiction as far as what the facts of the case were, looking at the different sources. I talked to Sandy. I said a couple of weeks ago, I said, are you seeing anyone that has the actual autopsy report online? And she said, I haven't run into that. I've run into a lot of articles that reference it. But I quickly became convinced that they weren't actually referencing the autopsy report. They were referencing other articles and books that had kind of set the stage for the supposed facts of the case.
Right.
I'll give you one example of actually the real big example that I think is very material to the case that has I don't have a good answer for without reading the autopsy report. By the way, I did find a site with the autopsy report, and it was behind a paywall, and they wanted some astronomical amount of money for it. So I kind of laughed.
Yeah.
But the big question I have was there's a lot of reports that she was found to have a swollen, contused, lacerated lip, a bloody nose, a fractured nose, everything all the way up to she was found to have several fractured ribs. Now, I think I've tracked that back to some early accounts of people that were there that supposedly said her body was in a lot worse condition. One reliable source I found really said the only thing that was visible was a slight bloody emesis from her nose. And that's extremely consistent with natural deaths as well. It's very common when people die to have emesis, to include bloody emesis from the nose. In a carbon monoxide poisoning, for sure, you could have some sort of either a blood or a pulmonary edema, like a kind of a slightly foam-like emesis from the mouth. And so given that, it was hard without reading the actual, they call them autopsy surgeons back then, which kind of leads me to think this was probably a moonlight gig back then, that these were not full-time pathologists, but they were local surgeons that also acted in capacity as a medical examiner.
So they could miss a lot.
I don't know that for sure. I mean, you would think in LA County, even in 1935, that it would be, you would have a full-time pathologist. You would think they would have enough work.
And we'd also have to remember there was a mass shooting the same day. So they were busy.
Oh, that's right.
Coincidentally.
I did not know that. Okay. I was not aware of that.
A public worker shot 5 of his coworkers and then shot a gas station owner the same day that she was brought in. So they were busy.
Wow. Why that concerns me is, let's operate from the theory that this is a murder. My big question is, what is the mechanism that was used to incapacitate her to then allow her to be left in a garage with a running car? There's a couple possibilities. One of them being a drug or some sort of a toxicology related. She was dosed with some sort of a drug and rendered incapacitated. And the other would be a physical incapacitation. It's extremely difficult to knock somebody out but not kill them for a length of time long enough for them to be breathing in carbon monoxide within the garage to actually kill her.
So you don't think she's passed out when she's placed into the car?
If it is truly a murder, I would say it would, in most circumstances, would kind of have to be, because otherwise she could just turn the car off. I did find some research. It was very well known back then not to be in, like it is today, not to sit in your running car and with your garage door closed. It was pretty well known that car fumes were toxic and could make you sick and or kill you. The other thing I really would like to see from the autopsy report was, so carbon monoxide is extremely unique in that it leaves what's called cherry red lividity on the skin. So lividity, or livor mortis, is the settling of blood after you die to wherever gravity is positioning you. So let's say, for example, I die on my back in my living room. And then it typically starts within a couple of minutes, becomes somewhat pronounced within a half an hour. And then it progresses over the course of about 8 to 10 hours to where it becomes what we call fixed. So think of when you press your fingers together and the blood escapes. You force the blood out of your fingertips and then let it go. And there's a refilling of the capillaries. There's like a white space, and then it turns red again as your blood refills those capillaries. It's somewhat similar in lividity. After 8 hours or so, it's going to actually stop. You can press on that skin and it's going to just stay a deep red purple is usually the color. It's kind of a bluish purple, starts as a very light and faint and then becomes very pronounced. With carbon monoxide, there's only a couple of reasons you would have different coloration of the lividity. Carbon monoxide is a big one. It's extremely noticeable. It causes this deep, bright, they call it cherry red lividity. It has to do with the binding of the carbon monoxide.
Your skin is bright?
It is bright. It's cherry red is a great way to describe it. I can't
remember. Did anybody describe her as bright?
I didn't see anything in there that described the actual lividity. And that was kind of one of the things that led me to believe people were not writing articles based off of source documents. They were citing other people's work. I mean, as we all know, the internet is just all factual all the time. But I think in this case, it was even worse than usual because it is 87 years ago. And the original documentation of it.
So your conclusion now, what conclusion can't you come to because you don't have that, those facts, that how long she'd been there?
Well, not just how long she'd been there, but I'm very curious as to the mechanism that left her. So I will say, I don't doubt that she had carbon monoxide poisoning. They did have the ability to test. While it's not the same testing they would use today, it does appear there were some blood tests that they could tell percentages of carbon monoxide in the blood. The reason I was describing the cherry red lividity is because that would be something that was obvious even back then, that they were, given the circumstances of the garage and car.
So it's Malibu in the winter months. If she's up in the car and it's carbon monoxide and it's chilly, it's cold, layman's terms, maybe by the time if she's there for 10 hours, or you would see that redness till she is exhumed, or what's the word?
Yeah, it would stay. It would stay that color post-mortem. It would not dissipate.
And a lot of people saw her. People that weren't the police, weren't detectives. DeChico saw her. West saw her. May saw her. I believe the house manager was named Rudolph. Rudolph and his wife.
Rudolph, yes.
So there's so many people at the scene. That's a disaster.
So I can't say I'm shocked from the time, but I did verify some photos I found of a captain of the criminal investigations unit or the homicide unit with, I don't know if it's the sheriff's office out there or if it was LAPD proper. There's a couple of famous photos of him posing with, that's the only word I can use to describe it, where he invites the press in. And you'll actually notice one of the photos is from the front. And I remember looking at the photo, I said, that actually looks like a real photo. I don't think this is staged. And I verified it through the Los Angeles Public Library had an archive of verified photos. And that was where that photo came from. There's also one from the passenger door, which you'll notice in the first photo, the passenger door is closed. In the second one, they allowed the press to open the door so they could get a nice shot across the street of Thelma Todd laying down, and the detective looking all, official, like he's pondering what happened to her. I did read a report that as soon as the photo shoot was over, the captain left the scene and that he was done. Needless to say, it's just bizarre and disgusting.
Yes, absolutely disgusting. JudyTrueCrime, do you have any questions so far for Kyle?
Well, my main thing, because I'm still fixated on that phone call of the woman saying she was supposedly Thelma Todd and still had her clothes on from Friday night or whenever. Yeah.
Right.
Was it really determined that she had died by Sunday morning, or could it have been later Sunday?
That's a great question. So I did spend a good amount of time thinking about that. So one thing, we kind of have a joke. It's kind of a very quiet, private joke in forensic science, modern term, that the biggest advances we've had lately is to undo some of the things we thought we knew to be true from years past. So one of those things is determination of time of death has proven to be incredibly difficult to nail down. There are absolutely some generalities, but the individual biology of the person, as well as environmental factors, it makes it a very complex system. So, like, think of the weather. It's like one change in the wind in California could be the difference in us getting rain on Tuesday or Wednesday in Texas. It's small things can cause big changes in different parts of the system. So determining time of death, there are absolutely some generalities, and I'd be happy to go through those, but I'm not convinced that they know that for certain. I know the friend you were speaking of, that left me extremely confused, though, because it would mean an extra day.
It was Mrs. Wallace Ford.
Yes. I don't know what to make of that, as far as it's just bizarre, because it would mean she was wearing those clothes for a whole nother day. I find it more likely it's, the old, you went out and had too much to drink, too much fun, and didn't make it out of your clothes from the night before. And that's typically indicative that you died sometime overnight or early morning, and not a whole, because I believe she said it was like 4:30 in the afternoon.
Yes.
Correct.
That she had called her. So we're talking about 15, 16 hours after when they're thinking that she had passed. Not to mention she's in the same clothes into the afternoon of the day before. I mean, it's,
I don't know if it's also a product of the newspapers kind of leaning into Thelma Todd is wild, and she was, out with this strange man with a dark presence and, in her old evening clothes. And I don't know, does it lead a little to a wanton woman or something like that? No, just me.
Do you think she didn't really say it, is what you're saying? Yeah.
I just think that the newspapers liked to lean into the drama of it all when Mrs. Wallace Ford said that she spoke to her and that she was still in her evening clothes, that they laughed like, oh, you're in your old evening clothes. How funny, come dressed however you are. Right. That to me sounds like something the newspapers would have
It is. Seriously. If it was concerning enough to you that you were still in your old evening clothes that you've had on now forever, enough to say it to the woman, wouldn't you just go change your clothes? If it was that important that, I have to warn you, I'm still in my ratty old evening clothes. Just go change your clothes.
And frankly, we all know that the only thing a woman's going to wear that long are sweatpants, a sweatshirt, and some fluffy slippers. That's it.
Well, yes. And what's the equivalent of sweatpants back then? I don't think it was evening gowns.
I kind of lean into Mrs. Wallace Ford, kind of wanted to be part of it all.
Yes.
And I'm sure it was a very exciting time. And she just burst out to somebody, how could that be? I just talked to her, without even thinking about it, and then having to just keep going with it.
Yes, maybe I can be a star.
Right.
Yes, I'm famous too.
But she never showed up at the party.
No, she never showed up at the party.
She never showed up at the party. So it was like establishing an alibi for Roland West has a wife or something, right?
Roland West has a wife, yes.
He got someone to make that phone call.
Yes, it could have been his wife, who, they seem to be, Roland West and Thelma Todd seem to be an item also.
Yes.
And Roland's wife was not living on the property at the time of all of this happening.
Uh-huh.
But there was a club upstairs called Joya, and I think that is Carmen Joya's last name, who is Roland West's wife. So Roland had Joya upstairs and Thelma's cafe downstairs. Mm-hmm. So that's a bit of a triangle.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Thelma living at the cafe and not Carmen. Just to review, we really do think that the facts of what Thelma body, the condition her body was in, is mostly secondhand. We don't know the lividity. Can you jump in there, Kyle?
We say it is lividity. It's shortened for livor mortis. That's one of the three main things we look at.
If you had to take a wild guess, what do you know how long you think she was in the car?
Without examining the body.
Do you think she died in the car?
I think I am willing to concede that there is a carbon monoxide angle to this, that was a basic enough thing to understand, even at that time in 1935. They apparently were savvy enough to note that the car battery was now dead and the gas tank was either empty or near empty.
I had read many reports that the ignition was on and there was still gas. So why did the car turn off?
Well, and I'm kind of wondering if 1930, and this is going way out there on a guess, way outside of my level of expertise, but I kind of wonder if an idling 1935 car without being driven wasn't pulling enough oxygen into the carburetor and could have choked itself out. And then the battery doesn't have an alternator to continue to charge it. So the battery dies.
My side theory is Roland went up to check, and when she was dead, he just turned off the car, but that doesn't explain why it was still on the on position, but maybe he did something checking on her.
What were the fingerprinting abilities back then? Anything?
Great question. So I actually just looked this up. So fingerprinting actually in the US goes, for identification purposes, goes back to the early 1900s. It kind of a fun fact. I found out it was used as long ago as 300 BC in China, that they figured out you would have a unique identifier by fingerprint. I was like, wow. But it took us till 1902, I think, is when it said. Now, and quite frankly, a lot of the techniques from back then are still very similar to what's used now. They use a very fine powder.
Kyle, how long before you start throwing those facts around on the next scene that you go to your coworkers? Did you know the Chinese?
Tomorrow. Just ask my wife. I'm like a random fact, useless knowledge dictionary.
Okay. So you were saying they use a fine powder?
Yeah, it sounds very similar. They use, I think it's like a volcanic ash that's finely ground up as your common fingerprint powder today. They also use some other techniques. They basically can aerate super glue and it'll adhere to oily fingerprint residue. That would be a more controlled scene. But the thing to keep in mind is half of our suspects are going to have their fingerprints there anyway.
All right.
Yeah.
Now, fingerprinting on bodies is not successful, contrary to what's on CSI of them lifting prints off of someone else's skin. It's extremely, extremely rare that would be an effective recovery technique for a fingerprint. So the car is probably, the door handle to the garage, how many times has it been opened? I mean, I don't know how much value I would put on anything they would find there.
Terry and I were fascinated when we were first discovering this case. The whole thing about what really mucks things up is we don't know about the position of the body, because where was she possibly before the door was open? Because if she was slumped towards the door in any way, we kind of lose that moment of you can walk in and look at the position in the body and go, oh, her face is on the steering wheel, so that's why she has a busted lip. But if she was moved, we wouldn't see that. Correct?
Well, I wouldn't read too much into the body position.
Okay.
So actually I did look at, by the way, I don't know if you actually looked at I think it was a 1934, 35 Phaeton.
Yes.
So they had these crazy big steering wheels with this huge metal thing right in the middle that, I mean, it looked nothing like a modern steering wheel other than it was round. Certainly if she even leaned forward, could have gotten a bloody nose on that. Could gravity have continued to take her to the side, or would she come to a final rest here? I mean, body position can kind of do a lot of weird things as it's falling or slumping.
That's another thing we always hear, if we're reading or any modern true crime, they're always like, oh, the body fell this way, the body fell that way. They make it sound, to me at least. And would you agree, Judy, that body position is very important?
I don't have a thought on that. Yeah, it seemed like hers, though. Didn't they at one point say that she fell to the side, to the floor? Did I not see that her body, that she was hanging off the seat or something?
She was slumped to the side, and that could have happened when they opened the door.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing to think too is when she was first found, I think by her assistant, it kind of sounds like she found her unresponsive and immediately ran inside. But at any rate, whoever first assessed her physically very well could have manipulated her, moved her. And quite frankly, they may not even remember it because it may be a moment of adrenaline. They're getting in there and, laying her down to try to wake her up. Or, I mean, I don't think CPR was certainly not a thing back then, but
the chain of custody was May and then Roland West.
Roland, right.
Yes.
Right. And then everyone else in LA County for. So the other big angle of this that we didn't talk about that I actually spent a little bit of time looking into was I really want to know what her toxicology is. Now, for several reasons, we're never going to know because of the year that this happened in. So on the autopsy, they concluded she had a 0.13% blood alcohol level. So that's just over 1.5 times the legal limit in most states. Pretty, it's a pretty solid buzz, drunk, but probably not incapacitated.
She wasn't driving. Yeah, so I'm sure she was celebrating. Yeah.
Right. So that's kind of just, a good night out on the town, but not like, into a typically a drunk, especially being that she's an experienced drinker by all accounts, that she's probably not passed out or blacked out at that level. But what's missing that did not exist at the time, and quite frankly, I'm not sure. I read in one place that they determined it from a sample of brain tissue. I am not familiar with what technique they would use to determine blood alcohol from a histology being tissue sampling of brain tissue. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just not familiar with it. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt that they knew how to do blood alcohol back then. One thing they most certainly did not know how to do was drug toxicology at the time. So drug presence, or we'll call that qualification. So whether it's positive or negative for whichever type of drug, and then quantification, meaning how much of that drug is in her system. Did not come along until gas chromatography used with mass spectrometry is the modern techniques.
I mean, I was thinking throughout the whole piece. I mean, yes, she was young, and this is a long night. I wondered if drugs were involved. I just kept thinking of cocaine or something like that. But that would not, I mean, it could stop her heart. Oh, I'm sorry, Judy.
No, I was just going to say, because I forgot she had a tooth extracted or something that morning.
Yeah.
Right?
She had a long day and being social the whole time. There was no nap. She was with her mother. There, a lot of driving.
No.
But she's still dancing at 2:30 in the morning. So I had my suspicions of drugs. What about you, Terry?
I wonder if there was a prescription given to her for tooth pain, or I wonder what sedative was available at the time when they were doing the tooth. And did that play any part, in it?
Yeah, so I actually looked into, so she had a clause in her contract, which was unfortunately pretty common for Hollywood actresses at the time. I've heard it referred to as a potato clause, in that if she gained more than, literally this is what they called it in the contracts. If she gained more than 5 pounds, her contract for movie deals was null and void. This was very, very common back then and very heavily enforced. I did more research on diet drugs of the 1930s than I ever thought I would do.
Oh, you're coming back.
So the most common at the time were amphetamines. Now, keep in mind, I actually looked at the timeline of the FDA and also Controlled Drug Act. This was a pretty wild and loose time for drugs. We think today you can't just go down to CVS and get yourself some pharmaceutical grade heroin or amphetamine for a toothache, but back then you pretty much could. The more common, there was starting to be some awareness around drug safety, but most of what the FDA did at the time was poisonous chemicals and exposure to those. So they were regulating a lot of pesticides, household cleaner type things to make sure, you weren't, I don't know what they knew to be poisonous, too much lead in, your household counter cleaner or something like that. There really wasn't a huge focus on the drug aspect. There was a tremendous culture, particularly among females of the 30s, to use amphetamines. Now, there's also this timing coincided. There was a period from the early 30s, like 1931, through about 1935 or 36 with a diet drug called DNP. Now, this drug worked, but it also turned out to be incredibly dangerous and was causing a lot of, if not outright deaths, was causing a lot of injuries because of the mechanism that it used it basically, for lack of a better term, it boiled you from the inside. It caused hyperthermia, meaning it would cause your temperature to rise.
But you look good.
So they actually outlawed that drug. It was proven to be so obviously dangerous by the end of the 1930s, I believe. It's like all these different things going on. She most certainly, by all accounts, was probably taking some form of an amphetamine or stimulant at a minimum, the diet aspect of her contract. Now, like you said, Sandy, that's not typically something that's going to bring you down in effect with alcohol. It's actually probably going to allow you to think you can drink more and stay awake, but isn't great for cardio health, obviously.
Right.
That was what I was thinking. You just said cardio. Were they able to rule out that it could have been a heart attack, especially if she's taking all these drugs, which I guess we've answered how she kept going all day. Did they rule out heart attack?
In my research, the only person who brought up the heart issue was Roland West's personal doctor. He's the one who brought that up. I don't recall the police ever even entertaining it, but he did a press conference and said that poor girl's heart just gave out. He had no official capacity in the case whatsoever, other than he was the first doctor on the scene because Roland summoned him and Rudolph went and got him, the house manager.
Right.
So, yeah, that's very interesting, though. What do you think going up those steps? Maybe amphetamines too much for the heart, and she did collapse in the car?
I can't say for certain. All I can do with this case is really look at the possibilities because it is.
Is there one that you're leaning towards?
I want to see more of is kind of the victimology of kind of a suicide profile. So if I have somebody, and I know, so let's pretend she's not a Hollywood starlet. This is just Bob Smith in his garage with the car running, and his neighbor comes and finds him. All day of the week, I'm going to be doing a suicide profile on him. I'm going to be looking into kind of what their state of mind was, particularly what was happening the night before. So one trend I've noticed in suicides, and I don't know that there's even any literature on this, is just my personal experience, is that suicides have several different categories of kind of what's happening with people beforehand. They're not as stereotypical as you might think, that they're necessarily well thought out, that they're something people have been ruminating on for a long time. There's a particular trend in suicides that I've noticed I've literally seen this hundreds, if not thousands of times. So there's a couple of risk factors that somebody typically has an underlying depression going on, but it may be well controlled and or they're able to put on a face in public. Now, there's an impulsivity angle, and it's usually substance abuse driven. So let me give you a scenario. Somebody that has an underlying issue going on, maybe they drink heavily one night, they're using drugs, gets in an argument with their spouse. It's typically with someone they're romantically involved in. And they impulsively, in their state of mind, being intoxicated, will impulsively kill themselves. And this is something that happens more commonly than you would ever believe was possible. Now, obviously, it's not that event may be the trigger. There's obviously underlying, generally untreated depression going on, but there can be kind of a traumatic trigger that causes, I actually have a term, I would call it the I'll show you suicide. It's kind of like a final act of as part of their depression. So I am kind of curious if, I know there was conjecture that she was locked out of the house by Roland, that maybe he told her, hey, I told you to be home at, by 2:00, and here it is 3:30 in the morning, why don't you go sleep outside, or, something to that effect, where there's some sort of a domestic altercation. I have nothing to say that this is what happened. These are just potential theories if you look at the suicide angle.
I can see being so angry, you're so wired out of your mind, and you have this fight, and you're just going up those stairs. I'll show them, I'll show him. I'm going to sell the business. I'm going to go back to New England. Yeah. What do you think, Judy?
Well, yes, that's what I'm thinking. And it almost goes along with Roland feeling responsible for her death and then trying to sort of massage it so that she's not, the time of death and whatever. So, yeah.
What do you think, Terry?
I think it's possible, sure.
Okay. Kyle?
That was one angle that, as Terry said, it's possible. I don't know how much faith I put in it. One of the big dangers in investigations is, you've heard the old proverbial tunnel vision. It's, you get a limited set of facts and you run with one theory or one suspect in a direction to the exclusion of all the other information that's available to you. This is a very real phenomenon that happens in homicide investigations, particularly in people that have, usually it's in a rural setting where the detectives may have very limited homicide investigation experience. When you have external pressures like you do in this case, because she's a celebrity, to come up with a conclusion, you tend to forget the principle of keeping it simple. So we tend to, the more famous a person is, the more conspiratorial the death will tend to be. It becomes hard to put them in a category of, how could Marilyn Monroe just, die of, of a drug overdose here? It has to be more involved than that. And of course, these people, they have these incredibly interesting, both in the good and bad of the people around them. I mean, if you look at the cast of characters around her, it really reads like a Hollywood script. So it's much easier, in my opinion, to insert the wild from, anything from just an accident or suicide to the wildest conspiracies of, I think the big one that was out there was Lucky Luciano being involved in this.
Right.
And I don't know if you, by the way, a little side note on this, I tracked that back because I saw one source saying there's no evidence that they even met. And then other sources saying that they had an on again, off again, tumultuous love affair and that he was abusive to her. And I'm like, these kind of seem like pretty disparate things to be not know the facts of. So that actually tracks back to a book written on her.
In the 1930s, if you just walked down Sunset Boulevard, you met Lucky. Those people were so entwined, actors and celebrities and supper clubs in Sunset Boulevard. I believe she knew, at least had met him. Now, I don't think I ever really was particularly thought it was the gambling. There's so many other ways to muscle in on a territory than kill the person.
Right. I couldn't agree more.
I was going to say, don't forget the red herring of the person who was extorting her. That was thrown in too, right? Wasn't there a whole story about someone had been extorting her and blackmailing her or whatever?
Sending her picture cards with threatening notes. And supposedly that was a mentally unstable janitor. He was kind of stalking her more than anything else, I think is what came to that. Oh, also, DeCicco, he could have, they, whispered to each other, meet me at, 3:00 on the pier. And she didn't actually go upstairs and knock on the door. Maybe she met DeCicco out on the beach and they fought and he carried her up the stairs to the car. Anybody?
Well, and the thing with DeCicco that really complicated this, it was well witnessed that they ran into each other at the Trocadero that evening. There's varying accounts as to whether or not they argued and she was really mad or if it was more of a civil affair. But the fact that they ran into each other again through one of these complicated side pieces into this whole thing where I was like, I would say, even though he was violent in the past, the fact that they had been separated, had gone their certain ways, if they hadn't seen each other, I'd say, probably pretty unlikely.
Yes, and he was being a bit of a dick because she wanted him as her date. Through the grapevine, he sends a message. He wants to go to the party through Ida. And Ida tells Thelma, I could just see the two women going, oh, this is perfect. Roland isn't going to be coming to the party. You can hang out with DeCicco. And then he shows up with a much younger woman and then acts like it was all a joke. And she sat there by herself. She could have been pretty upset about that.
Even years later, he's still exhibiting signs of controlling behavior and that he's in charge and, trying to push her buttons, so to speak, at the,
Yes. Nobody's going to hear a struggle on the beach. But then again, she didn't have a black eye that we know of. She didn't have a bruise. She didn't have strangulation marks or anything like that. So it's a mystery. Kyle, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, so the one final piece where I'd really be curious, and I don't know what their level of autopsy ability was like at that time. It was kind of hard to get a good working knowledge of it. But I'm very curious as to her neck and throat area that you had mentioned, because there wasn't, from what we can tell, a real apparent injuries to her other than these supposed accounts that she had broken ribs, but that doesn't seem to jive with what was actually found. So I'd be curious to know what level, if she had it, because typically if you don't have real obvious trauma, but there is homicidal violence involved, the first thing we're going to look at is hyoid structures on the neck, because you'd be surprised how many times strangulation will not actually leave physical bruising around the neck.
I did not
it's
know
actually found. Yeah, it actually, I was surprised even after I started in this field we saw numerous times that something about the case, we would be suspicious of something, and on the exam we would found fractured hyoid structure in the neck, which is indicative of a traumatic, typically like a strangulation. Again, it's all these theories that are out there right now. I mean, if we say that it is a homicide, suspect-wise, I would say Roland West probably has the most to answer for, as far as the motives are much clearer on his end. They're business involved and they're romantically involved. He clearly has some sort of control issues going on as well, being that he's married and also has his mistress living in the apartment next door, and the whole thing's, I mean, to each their own, but it sounds like some sort of a kind of bizarre, unhealthy situation going on. And he has control over the property there, so I mean, his access level is much better than a Pat DiCicco, or he lives there. So
Judy, has your mind been changed? What do you think?
Well, I feel the same. If it was a murder, that's the best suspect. But I do think, because of the whole drug thing mixed with alcohol, it could have been natural. It could have been from the drugs and alcohol. She could have died. But I think there was just ending up in that car there at night, other stuff. I don't know if West actually murdered her on purpose, but I think there's what might have been something contributory there.
Right. So you're the same. You're going to Roland West. Terry.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a really nice fat piece of information that's missing too. Like, had they had, maybe his wife had found out about the affair, or, whatever a motive might be, or she was about to, or I don't know what it could have been to motivate him to do that. Because that's a big step to kill somebody, obviously. So I don't know what that was. That would be great to know. The other things seem good and possible, but the pieces of them have to fall into place in a very specific way. If she's working off a drug she takes, if it was mixed with something that a dentist told her to take all day because she'd have a sore tooth, all those things line up. And then it leads to her being in a garage and keeping the engine running. And I don't know about that, but maybe. So I'm going to stick with mine. But I'd love to know one more thing that would just kind of tighten it all up.
If anyone out there has access to Thelma Todd's autopsy, we would love to see a copy of it. You can send it to the Writers Hangout podcast at gmail.com. We also have our IG page, or if you can just point us in a direction where we don't have to put a down payment to have access to it. I am still leaning towards Roland West, but I find the suicide angle very interesting. First of all, I'm fascinated by the potato clause and the drugs in the 30s. I just, for fun, I'm going to look that up. But this whole thing about, it's a long day, the tooth, the fighting, the ex-husband embarrassing her at the Trocadero. Maybe she did just go, I'm 29 in Hollywood. That's ancient. It's not. But maybe she was in a state and she did commit suicide. And when I first went into the Thelma Todd case, I thought that was not possible. I did not believe it for a second. But if it's a switch in your head that can just make you feel that way, I guess it's possible. So I'm Roland West, suicide, heart attack. Okay.
I'm just rolling.
You're just rolling. And Kyle?
I just don't know. If in the homicide category, I would certainly lean towards Roland West, but I would say suicide would be probably my top as far as the other circumstances going on.
Interesting. Well, you did change our minds in ways and highlighted and underlined other thoughts that we've had. I just want to thank you so much, Kyle, for taking the time to be on the Writers Hangout and studying this case.
Yay.
Okay, can I say one thing I learned that I liked? Lividity. It's short for liver mortis. I didn't know that.
I'm going to be using that for a band name one day, Liver Mortis.
Thank you all for having me. This was a lot of fun. I look forward to doing it again.
That's a wrap for the Writers Hangout. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, like, and thrive. Till we get to hang out again, keep writing. The world needs your stories. The Writers Hangout is sponsored by the Page International Screenwriting Awards. Executive producer, Kristen O'Verne. Producers, Terry Sampson and Sandy Adamitis. Music by Ethan Stoller.